Fearing Fascism and Funding Community. This week, historian Blanche Wiesen has been researching Eleanor Roosevelt for over a quarter of a century. She stops by to talk about her latest and final volume of biography on the war years and why the woman known as the First Lady of the World is more relevant today than ever. Then we take you inside one of Eleanor's most fascinating yet relatively unknown endeavors, the experimental and government-funded community of Arthurdale. That's all coming up on the Laura Flanders Show, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. Welcome. In 1940, Eleanor Roosevelt meditated on democracy. Quote, "While the ideal persists, if we are honest with ourselves," she wrote, "we will acknowledge that we have not carried it out. We still have slavery in different forms among different groups, and we have yet to accept the brotherhood of man as a basic truth. The melting pot of the world," she said, "we face almost an entire continent of vast resources. But we've allowed a situation to arise where many people are debased by poverty or the accident of race in their own country and have no stake in democracy, while others appeal to this old rule of the sacredness of property rights to retain in the hands of a limited number the fruits of the labor of many. Some of us have too much of this world's goods," she wrote, "and we are thereby separated too widely from each other." I was reading those words in Blanche Cook's mammoth biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, just as Oxfam was reporting earlier this year that the richest 1% of the world's population had snagged 82% of all the wealth produced in 2017, while the poorest 3.7 billion got none. I was still reading while I was hearing about raids on immigrants' homes and fathers seized at their kids' schools in January in New Jersey. At any time, but especially in this context, it was hard not to be struck by Blanche Cook's descriptions of Eleanor Roosevelt's torment over Red Scares, the rise of a racist right, isolationism, and the way her country turned its back for so long on refugees in the war years. You'll know then why I have asked Blanche Wiesen, author of 3 volumes of biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, back on this program. The War Years and After. That 3rd volume was one of the New York Times' notable books of 2016. Cook is Distinguished Professor of History and Women's Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where we are as we speak. Blanche, welcome back to the program.
Oh, Laura, it is so great to be with you. And you're reading from The Moral Basis of Democracy, that most important book that she wrote in 1940, is so important now, with 65 million refugees seeking haven around the world. And here we are in this moment of fascism having to deal with the history and the present of this horrible situation.
Well, that's why I started the way that I did. I mean, honestly, there's infinite value in reading this book at any time, but this 3rd volume about the war years and after and the lead up to the U.S. engagement in World War II is just chilling. And particularly to read it in the context of what's happening now. What stands out in your mind about what we need to know? I was struck, for one thing, about the origins of the phrase America First and where that came from.
Well, not only America First, but FDR, the juggler, who always said he never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing, so that he had to deal with a vicious Congress dominated by what we used to call Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with racial justice and who wanted nothing to do with Europe's war, which wasn't our war, who were isolationists, Republican isolationists, and Democrat Dixiecrats. And I mean, the good news is we didn't turn Nazi at the time. And there was a tremendous right-wing fascist movement in this country. And the Smith Act, which FDR signs, which condemns communism and un-Americans, whatever that means, un-Americans, anybody who dissented.
Kind of unleashed Red Scares,
Red
right?
Scares
Hearings in
all
Congress.
over. Not only Red Scares, but raids on people's homes and villages. And Eleanor Roosevelt was appalled. 1940, also, the Smith Act. FDR signed it. The Senate, it was something like 134 to 4.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the country was. And FDR, the juggler, said, make me do it, build a movement. And that was Eleanor Roosevelt's vision from the very beginning.
I mean, they are living
beginning
on kind of parallel tracks. She said, I'm the agitator, he's the legislator. He's the politician, has to balance. I can use my power. And she used her power in fascinating ways. And I think this is going to be a theme for our show this year. How does one use the power one has? I mean, she moved her chair in between the black and white of a segregated church. She famously rode in the Tuskegee Black Airmen's plane. She spoke at the NAACP when there were white riots against black workers in Detroit. What else should we be learning from her about how to deploy one's assets, whatever they may be?
Well, she was a writer and wrote My Day, her column, which was syndicated by over 300 newspapers every day. And she said, from the 1920s on, she was inspired to go door to door, block by block, to get our wants and our needs met. So we had to build movements and community. And that was her great vision.
But that can sometimes be abstract. But she literally brought people into the forums where she was. She took herself into those hearings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And she went all over the country. She saw poverty in West Virginia, and she built Arthurdale.
What was Arthurdale?
Arthurdale was this amazing community of the poorest people living in the worst conditions, coal miners in West Virginia. And Eleanor said, we're going to build a fabulous community here of private homes. Everybody had acreage to farm on, but best of all, indoor plumbing.
And how was it all paid for?
Some of it was paid for by the government, but she got her friends, including Bernard Baruch, to help pay for it. And Harold Ickes, the father of Harold Ickes in our generation, went to FDR and said, do you know what your wife is doing down there? She's spending money like a drunken sailor. And she's built hot and cold running water at a time, and flush toilets at a time when 85% of rural America did not have these things. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, well, it's time for everybody to have these things. Now and that was her great vision.
And presumably she wanted that to be a model.
She wanted it to be a model. She absolutely.
So it's sort of a horrifying question to ask what she would make of these times.
Oh. She would be an agitator and an activist, as we were in the 60s. Right. We had a show.
We had a show in the 80s, Blanche,
yes.
Please.
Okay. Before that, there was a show called Activists and Agitators on WBAI, and then we had our show.
Yes.
Right, together, a long time ago.
Long time ago. About women, though, and I want to ask you about misogyny. It's clear in the book how anti-communism was bound with anti-Semitism, was bound with xenophobia and anti-immigrant, anti-racism, anti-immigrant racism, and played out racism. What about misogyny? Where was that in that picture of those times? Because she certainly got a lot of grief.
She got a lot of grief. It's really interesting. And there's no biography, and I say this everywhere I go, there's no biography of Esther Lape, L-A-P-E. And Esther Lape was Eleanor Roosevelt's mentor in many ways, a great organizer. She fought for the World Court, and she had an idea for what we now call single-payer health care, socialized medicine. Everybody covered, nobody without health care. Easy, simple. And it was supposed to be in the 1935 Social Security Act, and the AMA lobbied it to death. And to this day, we still don't have single pay.
That's right.
It's amazing. So Esther Lape was her mentor, and Eleanor Roosevelt and Esther Lape really were part of a great movement of women politicians. And they are treated really miserably. But Eleanor Roosevelt gets cheered at a Democratic convention, the first woman really to be so honored. I was amazed at how people like Claire Booth Luce, who had started out as Eleanor Roosevelt's enemy, began to think Eleanor Roosevelt should be president.
Did they talk about it?
Yes, Claire Booth Luce did talk about it. And Eleanor Roosevelt said that she'd rather be chloroformed than run for office, because she wanted to be free,
Right.
and as a journalist, she could be free. And then she went off to the United Nations, where she worked for the State Department and, you know, did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and fought and fought and fought for equal rights for women, for equal rights for everybody, for human rights.
Where
for
do we
everybody.
stand with that project of, because she before the war, she was very involved in trying to prevent war, with you active with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, fighting for peacemaking mechanisms, which is, I think, what her idea of universal human rights was all about. Where are we with that project? It certainly seems like the laws of nations aren't holding up too well. Are there international, global structures
Well, Women's
today?
International League for Peace and Freedom celebrated the 100th anniversary in 2015, and Claire and I went off to Geneva to celebrate. To the Netherlands and wherever we went to celebrate. And ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's right.
The anti-nuclear group, Alice Slater, represented the U.S. In
People
Stockholm,
who got
and
nuclear weapons declared a war crime.
to have nuclear weapons
Outlawed.
outlawed. And there's a great big movement to have nuclear weapons outlawed.
But you'd have to admit, Blanche,
and-
that most of our social movements in the U.S. are increasingly, maybe this is not fair, there are exceptions, of course. COSECHA, the immigrant rights group, Black Lives Matter, have made connections globally. But I feel like there's less focus on the global and on questions of peace and militarism than there were, well, when we were doing that radio show together in the 1980s.
Right. I think one of the shocking things going on in the world is how many wars are going on in the world, civil wars and massacres. And the peace movement just doesn't have the power and strength that, of course, we need. We have to stop killing each other.
But is it not maybe
But
that we
it's-
don't understand the connections in the way that Ellen explained them?
Well, I think there's still the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, the greed. Eleanor uses, in the moral basis of democracy, she uses the word greed.
Right.
We are not going to have peace until we have economic justice.
Yeah.
She says that. We're not going to have peace until people are fully educated, until everybody is educated so they can understand what is going on. And then when we have everybody, and I think the war against public education is also part of this. I think we're in a very frightening fascist, proto-fascist moment where public education is being cut all over, public schools are being closed all over the country, and we don't know what's going on, and the military-industrial complex, the greed heads are totally in power. It's a frightening moment.
Eleanor, I love, even in that little phrase that I quoted at the top, talks about the problem with this inequality is that it separates people.
That's right.
You know, her commitment to, her belief that if we could just bring people together
Right.
to meet each other, to
and
to
talk
have
to
a
each
meal
other.
together.
Right. And she became a very big supporter and fan of Wendell Willkie.
So talk about that.
Okay, Wendell Willkie runs against FDR in 1940, and they become friends. And it's Wendell Willkie who brings up the question of race. We have to desegregate this country. How can we fight fascism if we are bigots here? We have to desegregate the military. He says it publicly, vigorously. Eleanor Roosevelt's been saying it for years.
Right.
And then FDR sends him on a round the world tour where he has, this is 1943, where he has an epiphany. Everything that happens everywhere affects everybody everywhere.
Yeah.
We are all connected. We are one world. And that has been, again, something Eleanor Roosevelt has been saying this for decades.
That's right.
We are all connected. We are one world. And then she goes to the UN, and that effort that she really thinks the United Nations will bring us peace, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will bring us justice and peace, and she fights for it to the end of her life.
So you've dedicated a quarter of your life to these beautiful books, 3 volumes. You're done?
I'm done.
At this point, looking at all this,
Yeah.
where are we? I mean, on the sort of arc of history, I feel like it's been tilting towards justice for sure, legal desegregation, etc. But it feels like we're at a bump.
We've got to do it again. There are things we've got to do again. We've got to go door to door, block by block. And we've got to be shoulder to shoulder, hearts open, fists high, in protest, in dissent, when horrible things happen. And we've got to march again, my darling. That is what we have to do. Eleanor Roosevelt was right. And she said, you know, I always say never go anywhere without your gang, Fordham, Daggers, right, the Bronx. But Eleanor Roosevelt networks of people together. And, you know, we have your show, we have Amy Goodman, Democracy Now!, we have the news, we have commondreams.org in Portside, and we need, you know, we've got to get past the censorship, we've got to get past the ignorance, we have to fight for the unions make us strong, we have to fight for public education and teachers. Eleanor Roosevelt said, I can give you full employment and 100% literacy. How? 1 teacher, 5 students.
Yeah.
That will get us beyond the bump.
We are losing a generation. Many of her generation who had their roots in the 30s are no longer with us. Harry Belafonte is a notable exception. There are exceptions, of course.
And Harry Belafonte became her great friend. And she read that he couldn't get an apartment, and she called him up and said, well, you could come live with me. I have lots of room. And so he and Lena Horne bought a building on West End Avenue and said, no, we've figured it out.
I think they made it a co-op.
They made it a co-op, yes. But it's a wonderful story.
Yeah. I was going to ask, we have your books, but how do we keep that connection alive, or do we need to? Are there new connections to different generations, to different eras that will keep the ideas alive?
Well, I think we need to build and rebuild movements. So there is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It has branches all over the country. There are new anti-nuke movements, new anti-radiation movements, you know, Joe Mangiano, and people are really organizing, and we have to go with the organizing.
And what are you doing next?
I might do a memoir with Claire Koss, my partner.
Do it. A partner memoir.
Yes.
I love it. Blanche, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for your work
Thank
and
you
your support
so
over the
much.
years.
Thank
Blanche
you.
Cook. There are 3 volumes. They're all worth reading and reading again. Thank you so much. You heard Blanche Cook refer to the experimental community of Arthurdale, West Virginia. It was a place Eleanor Roosevelt set out to help after visiting during the Depression. It's a story worth remembering for a few reasons. For one thing, it shows what government can be forced to do when there's a real threat of revolution: electricity, indoor plumbing, a refrigerator, free education. It was all provided free by the federal government. It's also a reminder that segregationists and private corporations will do almost anything to suppress alternatives, and ultimately how important it is that change come primarily from below, not above. To get a glimpse of what this model actually looked like, we found this old documentary by filmmaker Ross Whitney. Thank you to West Virginia Public Broadcasting for letting us use this footage. Take a look.
I was a coal miner. I worked up Scotts Run, lived up Scotts Run.
Everything was down.
In 1932, cutthroat competition in the coal industry, mine strikes, and the use of scab labor to break unions created fertile ground for Communist Party organizers. The problems in Scotts Run were larger than local agencies could handle. Then, in 1933, events in Washington would provide an answer to some of the families in Scotts Run. Both FDR and Eleanor believed the root cause of these slums was the laissez-faire, haphazard way in which industrial areas grew. To Eleanor, the solution seemed obvious. Eleanor's plan was to resettle hundreds of destitute miners from Scotts Run to the country, to a new subsistence farm-like community named Arthurdale. She also wanted the government to build a nearby factory to provide employment for the homesteaders. Over 600 families from the coal camps applied to live in Arthurdale. Social workers were sent to screen the applicants. While looking for prior farming experience and good physical and mental health, they also probed into marital relationships, as administration official Wendell Lund recalls.
You could take only so many. There were some people who couldn't be considered.
Families who applied from Scotts Run represented the American melting pot. They were black, white, Irish, Polish, and Italian. But those chosen had one thing in common.
They were whites.
One of the stories that I have heard about from that angle was that Mrs. Roosevelt wanted to bring blacks. And it was brought up at one of the meetings, and they said, well, what about schools? Well, they could go to school together, and in those days it was segregated schools. And there would have been two school systems.
Mrs. Roosevelt was disappointed, but construction continued. By the summer of 1934, less than 10 months after Eleanor visited Scotts Run, the first group of homes was ready. 2 bedrooms, living room, dining room, and kitchen with electricity, indoor plumbing, and 2 to 5 acres for a garden and livestock. By this time, the community was fairly self-contained. Homesteaders were growing their own food, building new homes, and making their own furniture. A unique school was opened as part of the experiment. The community seemed to have everything it needed to succeed. It lacked only employment for the homesteaders.
Communities have to have a store, maybe more than one store, post office. So, voila, there was a little shopping mall. And so on. Anything they wanted until they got to the point of building factories to give the people employment. Then Congress reared up on its hind legs and said, no, you'd be competing with private business.
At first, plans were made to build a plant in Arthurdale which would make furniture for the U.S. Postal Service. However, a private company in Indiana already held the postal contract, putting the president in an ideological dilemma. A factory in Arthurdale would put hundreds out of work in Indiana. So when Congress opposed the factory contract, the president backed off. But Eleanor didn't give up. She persuaded Wall Street financiers, cabinet members, and congressmen to visit Arthurdale in hopes of obtaining a factory. Some factories were persuaded to move here, and shirts, radio cabinets, and vacuum cleaners were made in Arthurdale. But the weak consumer demand during the Depression helped cause each of those industries to fail. Many factors contributed to the downfall of the cooperatives. Common to each were high labor costs. Despite the fine quality of the furniture produced at Arthurdale, the production process was highly inefficient, and so the furniture was overpriced. The general store did show a small profit in its first 9 months, but the homesteaders soon began shopping in nearby Masontown, where prices were lower. In some ways, the homesteaders had grown too dependent on Eleanor and federal support. They were without home rule. and were ill-prepared to govern themselves. In 1947, the National Housing Agency, the last of 5 departments to run Arthurdale, sold the homes to the homesteaders. The first experiment in subsistence homesteads ended.
Building a new community and with decentralized industry, with subsistence farming and all of that, was not always the shared dream with the homesteaders. Those of us who came, we came wanting a home of our own.
We finally realized that the kind of experimental school which Miss Clapp established was not satisfactory to the people. It was a new idea, and the people wanted what other communities had.
Thanks for watching The Laura Flanders Show. If you want to receive weekly commentary from me or find out early what we've got coming up, sign up to become a monthly member on our Patreon site and receive exclusive access to member-only content, including extra interviews, podcasts, and more good stuff. Don't forget, you can follow us on social media and feel free to write to me and tell me what you think. That's Laura, Laura, at lauraflanders.org. And thanks for watching. Stay kind, stay curious. Till next time, I'm Laura Flanders.